Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you here. I'm Alexandra Schneiders. I work at the UCL Energy Institute in London in the UK. And my research is on peer-to-peer energy trading with technologies such as blockchain, so distributed ledger technologies. And I look at the policy and legal aspects of this. So I have a background in law and policy. I used to work in Brussels before I worked here in political affairs, legal consulting. And yeah, now I'm working on this topic here, which is very exciting. I'm also looking at sandboxes. Yeah, so you should be able to see the slides moving now, I hope so. So yeah, as I said, I have law and policy background. I'm part of the Energy Web Research Consortium here in the UK, which my research, which is the framework within which my research sits. And what will I talk to you about today? Well, I will, first of all, quickly explain what a regulatory sandbox is. Then I will say why it's necessary in the energy sector. I will give examples of existing sandboxes, talk about the pros and cons, give recommendations for future sandboxes, and then conclude with some final points. And I look forward to your questions at the end, by the way. So yeah, after my presentation you can ask questions. So what is a regulatory sandbox? Well, there does not seem to be one definition of a sandbox. As you will see when I will describe them, there are many types of regulatory sandboxes. So I think that in a nutshell you can say that a sandbox is basically an entity, a central entity like an energy regulator that allows you to trial a new business model with a new technology, and that you're not sure will be legal or will fit within the current legal framework. And then that trial will take place within real life conditions, let's say, so with real consumers, and yeah, so it's supposed to be as realistic as possible, and it happens within a set amount of time, so a limited amount of time. And at the end of the trial, so during the trial you also get derogations. This is important. So any obstacle in the law that you think is stopping you from rolling out your business model, that obstacle is removed for you. So you then get a derogation from the law. So for example, peer-to-peer energy trading, that's not legal in many countries. Then within a sandbox you can do that, even if it's not legal. So it's like it allows you to trial something that is not allowed in law. And the results of the trial are then used at the end to see whether policy or laws should be changed so that these business models can then take place in real life and can become legal. And the term sandbox actually comes from software development, so IT. And it was basically called a sandbox because these developers could test new code within a controlled environment, so that if there was any negative consequences, they wouldn't damage the entire system. It would just be like a controlled damage, let's say. So this is the same idea here, that you test something, and if it goes wrong, it cannot corrupt the entire system. It just happens within the small ring-fenced environment that the trial is taking place. And the first sandbox was by the Financial Conduct Authority here. It's the Financial Services Regulator in the UK, and they launched the sandbox in June 2016. And since then, this phenomenon of sandboxes has gone over from financial services to energy. And it's interesting because energy is an over-regulated sector in many countries. And I think that the sandbox is a very timely development in the sector, because there are new technologies coming up, new players. As we know, the energy sector is decentralizing, so undergoing decentralization due to, for example, renewable energy technologies becoming cheaper, and this is causing them problems with injecting this energy into the grid, with balancing supply and demand. And also there is more pressure from the top. So for example, the EU setting very ambitious targets in its new legislation around energy and climate change, so giving energy consumers a more active role. And in order to make all these things happen, you need to then have new innovations, new technologies that you can use to give consumers more power over their energy use, and also help balance supply and demand with more renewable energy on the grid. So yeah, a sandbox is very useful because you can look at these new technologies and see how how consumers would be treated with using this new technology or new business model. I'm taking the example again of peer-to-peer energy trading. You could see how consumers would be better off or not, how they would be hurt by such a practice. And yeah, so I think that's also the job of the energy regulator, to make sure that consumers have the best for them out there, and this could include new technologies, but before you know that, you have to test it out within a controlled environment. Also, I think that Sandbox is useful because technology moves quicker than legislation, so you have the problem that legislation will always be behind technological developments because it's much slower to draft laws. And that's a problem that you see right now also with, for example, Airbnb and Uber, other sectors undergoing decentralization, that you have this breakdown in communication between policymakers and the startups. And you want to avoid this taking place, especially in the energy sector, which is a very vulnerable sector and fragile sector. So a sandbox would allow you to have continuous dialogue between policymakers and business, and also policymakers can keep up with their legislation at the same pace as the technology develops. So I think it's a good system, as you will see later. So there are a few energy sandboxes out there, and most of them are in Europe. And the list is growing. So I mean, yeah, within a few months, I think there will be even more sandboxes coming up. And the one that I have the most knowledge of is the UK one, since I am based in the UK, which is called Innovation Link. And you also have one in the Netherlands, Experimentele Regeling. You have one in Belgium, Germany, Italy, Singapore, and France was going to have one. I'm going to talk to you a bit about that as well. Australia is planning to have one, and the list goes on. I think the list of countries will grow with time. So for the UK sandbox, which is called Innovation Link, basically what happens is you have an entity such as a startup, for example, or a company. They have a new idea. They want to do something that has not been done before. They don't know if it's legal or not. So what they do is they go to Ofgem, the energy regulator, which runs a sandbox. They go to Ofgem and they say, I think that what I want to do is not legal. Can you help me out? So Ofgem has an advisory service where they first sit down and talk with the companies and startups, and then they can see if it's actually legal or not, their idea. And a lot of the time, it is possible to do it within the current legal framework, so they don't need a sandbox, which is why they have this advisory service. And if, however, it is not possible to roll out their ideas within the current laws, then they need a sandbox. And in order to go into the sandbox, you need to fulfill certain criteria. For example, your idea needs to be innovative, so it shouldn't already exist. And it should be beneficial for energy consumers and not hurt them. There should be also a regulatory obstacle that stops you from rolling out your idea. And it should also be trialed, so ready for trialing and not too immature, let's say. And then if those conditions are fulfilled, you're allowed to test your idea in the sandbox with derogations from whichever legal obstacle you identified. And then the trial can take a maximum of 2 years, which is quite a short amount of time. During those 2 years, Ofgem keeps an eye on your trial. You report the startup reports back to Ofgem, and at the end of the trial, the startup or company then tells Ofgem how the trial went, and all these findings are then put into reports, and they're made public except for sensitive information, which is not included in the documents. And what is important here is that in the Ofgem trial, you can only participate if you have a license or if you partner up with a licensed entity. So a license to generate, distribute, or supply energy. And it's also, you can only ask for derogations from laws enforced by Ofgem. And Ofgem is in charge of granting licenses. So basically you can get derogations from anything in the licensing conditions. And also it's responsible for consumer well-being, so there may be something you can derogate from there. But my point is that it's quite limited because you can only derogate from laws enforced by Ofgem. And in the UK there are many other applicable rules that are run by other entities, not Ofgem, and you cannot derogate from those. So that is an issue here, I think. Then under the Ofgem Sandbox, recently there has been a new development, which is that the entity in charge of balancing and settlements, called Elexon, has decided to open a sandbox, which will still be run by Ofgem as a gatekeeper, let's say. And this Elexon Sandbox then allows for derogations from the Balancing and Settlement Code, only from those rules. And it has an interesting deviation from the Ofgem process, which is that the trial can be 2 years, but you also get a 1-year transition period where you can ask for a modification in the rules that you thought were an obstacle to your business idea. So here you have a real a chance to change the rules so that afterwards you can continue running your idea without disruption. Because, for example, if after the 2-year trial there is no change in the rules and your idea is still not legal, let's say, then you have to completely stop your trial and dismantle it, and that means uncertainty for everyone involved. So for the consumers that are taking part in the trial, but also for investors, for the startups involved. So with the Elexon one, you then have this 1-year frame where you can ask for a change in the rules, and yeah, I think that this is a positive aspect. The Elexon Sandbox is only open for parties to the Balancing and Settlement Code, so you have to be part of that code, let's say. So it's also limited in terms of who can participate in the sandbox. So those are the two then main UK energy sandboxes, I would say. Then you have other ones across Europe. You have the one in the Netherlands, which is a bit older than the one in the UK, and it started in 2015, I think, or 2016. And this is run by the Enterprise Agency in the Netherlands. And this is quite a different sandbox. So the focus is also quite different, because the Ofgem one, I have a feeling, is much more about innovation in the energy sector and welcoming new participants and competition, whereas the Dutch one is more about meeting the climate targets and getting more renewables in the energy system and making consumers more active. So it's a different focus, and it's also a much longer trial period. So it's a 10-year trial, which is much longer than the 2 years in the UK. And it's also only available to some stakeholders, so it's only available to owners associations and energy cooperatives. And I think that the purpose of this was to so that the consumers that participate are kind of like protected by a legal entity. So for example, cooperative, that it can protect the consumers involved in the trials. And this is why in the Dutch sandbox the trials are much more, are larger than the UK ones. So here you can have trials with up to 10,000 consumers, And yeah, the people in the sandbox can have much more freedom to do different things than the UK one. However, here you can, the government, or I think yeah, the government has basically said that you can only derogate from certain provisions in the main electricity law, which relate to supply, distribution, and generation of energy, and within a local community, energy community. So it's only specific provisions that you can derogate from in the Dutch sandbox, but it allows for much larger trials with many more consumers and for 10 years, which is quite a long time. Although you could question, is it maybe too long for, if you're testing technologies like blockchain, for example, can you really is it really feasible to, is it really realistic to have such a long amount of time for a technology like blockchain, which changes so quickly? However, after the 4 years, the ministry can always end the trial if it thinks that it serves no purpose. So there is still that 4-year mark, but it's still, yeah, quite a long time, let's say. And so basically, the sandbox has ended now. However, they're thinking of starting it again, but then with less restrictions, so making it open for more stakeholders, and also not predetermining which laws you can derogate from. And an announcement will be made in later this year. And also, by the way, if you want more details on these sandboxes, ISGAN, so it's the International Smart Grid Action Network, they have this very useful casebook where they describe some of the sandboxes that I'll be talking about. So you can also have a look at that document for more details. Then there's the Belgian sandbox, which started this year in February, and it was started by the system operators, the TSO, DSOs. And this is an interesting initiative in that it's not really clear how they will derogate from laws, but at this moment what happened, according to my understanding, is that they opened a competition for academics and businesses to propose solutions to give energy consumers more control over their data. So I think the focus here is on data and building like a platform so that data exchange is quicker and giving consumers more choice. And they had this competition, and 8 ideas won the competition. It was announced a few days ago. And then these ideas will be developed in a sandbox environment so that they can be made like more large-scale trials, let's say. And then apparently they will then get legislative derogations, and then we'll see what happens. But yeah, it seems that it will last a few years, this sandbox. And it's interesting that they're making it kind of an open competitive process where anyone can join and pitch ideas. So when I was looking at the list of companies involved, I also saw UK companies. And I think that that's good that they're opening it up to international ideas and talent. So yeah, that's quite a positive aspect of the Belgian sandbox. And the German one, it has some parallels with the Belgian one in that it was also a competitive process. And this then implied having 5 large-scale trials called showcase regions in different regions in Germany. And the sandbox was run by the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. And the energy regulator was also involved in this. And from what I understood, applications are no longer welcome, but the aim of the sandbox is to demonstrate that the balancing of supply and demand, let's say, when there's so much renewable energy being fed into the grid, I think that's a problem, and it has been a problem in Germany. So that's the solutions they're looking for, and also in this competition, that's what applicants were bidding for solutions to this balancing of supply and demand issue. And also the participants got funding. So this is also important because the other sandboxes I've mentioned, there has been no funding. So it has to be self-funded, whereas Germany has provided funding for the trials, which I think makes things easier. Then the sandbox will be lasting for 5 years, and I'm a bit conflicted as to whether it can be entirely called a sandbox, because from what I've read in the literature, it's given derogations for financial burdens. So for example, if the entities running the sandbox have a lot of costs in the balancing of supply and demand of renewable energy. Then they're derogated from having to pay this themselves because they have funding. So it's not entirely clear how this is a proper regulatory sandbox, this one. But in the literature, it says that the only really derogation from legislation is that DSOs can kind of do what they want here. They can create internet platform and kind of trial different options for energy consumers. So this German one is not fully regulatory sandbox. It's, yeah, I think it's an attempt at it. Then we have the Italian one, which is also an interesting one because here the energy regulator has predefined the regulatory exemption. So it has decided to focus on specific topics, for example, EV recharge and smart grids, and then it has defined itself what the exemptions from the law will be, so the derogations, and then it has run a contest. So anyone who has ideas can apply, and then they can trial their idea, and at the end of this process, the regulator then looks at whether it should change the law or not. And it then has had a consultation, so it consulted others on this legal change, which I think is an interesting aspect that other sandboxes don't have. And the program ran from 2010 to 2019. So from what my understanding, it was a few years for every different topic. So a trial was not 9 years basically. It was a few years for each trial. And yeah, so that's the Italian sandbox, and there's the Singapore one, which has a parallel with the Italian one in that it also involves a consultation, public consultation. So whenever, after the trial takes place, then the energy regulator will consult on how it can change the law and what its thoughts are on changing the law, which I think is an interesting approach. So it's not just a single decision, it's a group decision, let's say. And for the sandbox one, for the Singapore one, I also did not see any defined timeframes for trials because the other sandboxes have very strict timeframes. Like the UK one has 2 years, and the Dutch one 10 years. This one did not really have a defined timeframe, so I think it's very much tailored according to the trial, which I think is a good thing because you can then see what each trial needs, let's say, and give them the amount of time necessary to also maybe consider extra time for changing the laws afterwards. So it's a tailored approach, which I think is very positive. And interestingly, in the requirements, they say that those applying for the sandbox cannot really participate if they can test their idea in a laboratory or test environment. Which I found was an interesting criteria because the other sandboxes seem to be very open to any idea applying, but here they say that if you can test it in a lab, then don't apply to the sandbox. So I found that was a bit restrictive, that criteria. Then the last one I'm going to talk to you about is the French one, which does not exist yet, but it was supposed to actually be launched soon. So the French one, the Energy Sandbox, the initiative was from the Energy Regulator, CRE, and they included an article in this new law called the PACT law, P-A-C-T-E, which was quite a controversial law from my understanding because it wanted to nationalize a lot of industries, and this law was actually taken to the Constitutional Court because of this reason, because it was quite a controversial law. And in that law there was a sandbox initiative, the sandbox article. However, the Constitutional Court has decided to remove that article from the law, even though it was not one of the contested articles, and it said that the sandbox was not in the spirit of the overall law, so it removed it. And I found that quite a shame actually, because I think that yeah, a sandbox is a good thing to have, but I think that they will try to bring it back in another law, but it could take a while before it will become reality in France. So I think that the sandbox is a good initiative, because it allows for testing of new ideas, getting to know business models and technologies, and seeing how they're good or not good for consumers. So it allows for very flexible and evidence-based regulation and policy making, and I think that if you draft a law without having this evidence on new technologies, then you're kind of doing it blindly, and you risk of always being behind the technology. So always having to change the law because the technology moves so fast, so you're always one step behind the law. But with the sandbox, you can observe it live, and you can then think about how you will adjust the law according to the technology. So I think that it's a very positive development, especially in the energy sector, which is undergoing so many changes right now. And it's also a win-win situation because not only does the regulator learn from a new technology, but the businesses that are participating also learn from the regulator. So they see how their idea is good or not for consumers, and they get feedback. And yeah, so I think it's a dialogue between both business and regulators, which, as I said, right now is not happening in a lot of other sectors. And there's been a breakdown of communication between policymakers and startups. But the sandbox promotes continuous dialogue, and it also enables the regulator to fulfill its role of seeing what's the best options for consumers out there. So if you have a sandbox and you open it up for different ideas, then you can see what is good for consumers, and then you can fulfill your role as a regulator. So also, I forgot to mention, but as you saw in these previous sandboxes that I talked about, they're all very different in terms of aims. So some of them are aimed more at climate targets and including more renewables in the grid, like for example the Dutch one, the German one, whereas other sandboxes are more about promoting innovation and having more competition, like the UK one and Singapore. So it's a very fragmented landscape out there of the different sandboxes, and also they have different approaches. So some sandboxes, they just allow the business to come to them. They leave their door open, and then they have a conversation first to see if a sandbox is necessary, and also to see what the problems are with the law. Whereas other sandboxes, like the Italian one and Dutch one, have already defined which laws can be derogated from. So you have less of approach where you have dialogue and it's more predefined by the regulator. And personally, I think that the approach of just first having a conversation, seeing what the problem is better, because then you can adjust your services and the sandbox according to the problems of the day, let's say. So that brings me to the cons of the sandbox process. And I think that even though it's a good idea, I think that there's lots of uncertainty around the sandbox. So the fact that it's such a new thing, because the sandboxes I talked to you about are only a few years old, and there's no proof of how they will actually change legislation or not. So it's really uncertain as to whether they will really have an impact or not in the long term. Also, from what the Financial Conduct Authority and Ofgem have said so far, is that a lot of the companies and startups that are going into the sandbox are kind of looking for, how do you say, like the regulator to say your idea is fine and it's viable. So it's much more reassuring for investors and the startups themselves, and much more also of a PR exercise, let's say, that the fact that they're in the sandbox, they get more advertisement and more attention. And so that has become clear so far, that the sandbox has provided kind of like a platform for these companies to profile themselves and to also get the okay from the regulator on how viable their idea is. But that's not entirely the aim of the sandbox. The sandbox is also meant to lead to more flexible legislation and policy making, and it's not clear if that will happen or not in the long term. So there are also competition concerns. As I said, those that are in the sandbox kind of have an advantage because they can then have a close conversation with the regulator on their ideas and how it's good for consumers or not. They can also hear from consumers directly what they think of their business model, because after all, consumers will be the ones that will be accepting the new technology or business model, so it's very important what consumers think. So if you're in the sandbox, you're in a privileged position. And this also leads you for afterwards, if you want to launch at a wider scale in the real world, let's say, then you have much more knowledge than other companies who would not have been in the sandbox because they cannot roll out their own ideas. So I think that a solution for this is transparency, making everything public. So all the documents, the reports, during the trials, at the end of the trials, make everything public, remove sensitive information, but share as much as possible with other entities that could not be in the sandbox, that don't have the luck of being in the sandbox. Then there are the time frames. As I said, for example, the UK one has 2 years for trials, and that I think is not enough to then look at changing the rules during the trial so that the trial can continue beyond the sandbox. And I think that the 10 years of Netherlands is a bit too long, perhaps, and the 2 years of the UK is too short. Maybe something in the middle is what the French had in mind, like 4 years. I think that could be a decent amount of time. So the time frames are a problem. The fact that not all the stakeholders can take part in the sandbox. So as I said, the UK one, the Dutch one, you can only take part if you're a licensed party or a partner, or if you're an energy cooperative or owners association. So also another issue is the fact that a lot of these sandboxes don't provide funding. So if you're not lucky enough to have the money to participate, then you can't really participate. And then you do not get all the relevant stakeholders at the table, and you cannot get a realistic picture of how it would happen in real life. So this is a problem. Then the legislation, as I said, some of these sandboxes it's already determined which legislation you can derogate from, and other ones you can only derogate from certain legislation, not others. And I think that this also poses a problem in giving a realistic image of how it would happen in real life, because then I think you need to really test with all the applicable legislation. So for example, if you look at using blockchain for peer-to-peer energy trading, you not only have energy legislation that's relevant, but also data privacy like GDPR problems and smart contracts, contract laws. So it's really many more laws that are relevant here and not just one set of laws. So you need to test as many laws as possible to really get a good image of how consumers would be impacted afterwards. So I think that's, those are basically the main cons. What I can recommend for future sandboxes, the model in the UK is a very good model where you leave the door open and you let startups come in or whoever is interested in having a new idea, and then you have a dialogue, because then you can filter those that do not need a sandbox, and you can save yourself from the headache of having to filter through thousands of applications that actually don't need a sandbox, because what they can do now is perfectly legal. And so yeah, I think that the advisory services also provides you with a good idea of what the problems are in the so you can tailor the sandbox accordingly. And also, I think that, as I said, you have to keep it as realistic as possible. So make sure that the more stakeholders, the better can participate. Also, there's a problem with funding, so making sure that there's enough funding available, and if there isn't, so then making sure that the funding deadlines are in line with the sandbox deadline. Because imagine that a trial does not get the funding on time and it's accepted into the sandbox, then it would not be able to start the trial because they would not have the money. So I think that the funding deadlines and the sandbox deadline should be aligned with each other. Then also make sure that as many rules as possible can be derogated from to reflect reality as much as you can. Also the time frames, allow enough time for a trial to take place so that you not only get a good idea of the technology and the consequences, but also of if the law can be changed during the trial so that the trial can continue afterwards and there are no uncertainty problems. Then transparency is very important. As I was saying, it's important to make everything public so that anyone who's not able to be in the sandbox can kind of feel like they're part of it, so they can learn from the sandbox as well. And you don't have complaints, as with the sandboxes here in the UK, where people are saying that it's unfair competition because only those that are accepted can benefit from feedback from the regulators. So make as much as possible publicly available. And the staff issue is also important because here in the UK there are quite a lot of people working on the sandbox at the energy regulator, because they have to be there, first of all, to give advice for the advisory service, and afterwards for the sandbox you have to have someone who keeps continuous track of your trial and is always there as a point of contact, and at the end can also publish the reports and all that. So I think that if a new country is considering having their own sandbox, they should put enough people working on it to make it a success, or else it won't work. So that's a very important point. Then the other point I wanted to make is that some trials, from what I understood here in the UK, could not start because they were not entirely, they had some problems with the trials. So it's important that the trial is really ready to go when the sandbox starts, and that everything is clear. So as they say, as Alexandra says, that not just lab ready, but also field ready, that you're able to roll out the trial on the field, and uncertainties have been resolved, because then that can delay the trial in the sandbox, and it can eat up into the limited amount of time that you have to test your idea. And then another thing that I noticed was that a lot of sandboxes have documents in their own languages only. And as I said, the Belgian one has people from other countries taking part, like Belgium, UK, I mean. And if you make your documents available in a language that most people can speak, for example, let's say English, then you can have people from other countries participating and bringing in their ideas, and it can be more of an open process. So I think that it would be good to publish sandbox documents in a language that most people can speak, so that you open up the process to other ideas from other countries, and that's beneficial to the energy sector in your country. Then the last point here is I'm going to work myself on a new initiative under the DSM-TCP called the Global Observatory on Peer-to-Peer and Community Self-Consumption, and we will probably be looking also at the sandboxes in different countries, and so I think that international fora like that are good to provide feedback and to compare the different countries. Then, in conclusion, what I can say is that I think the sandbox is a step in the right direction. I mean, it's already a big step to take, especially in an over-regulated sector like energy, where the actors have been quite close to innovation. Now, all of a sudden, they open themselves up by having the sandbox, which I think is a good thing. You get, if you have a sandbox, you get to move at the same speed as innovation, so you're not one step behind. And you have continuous dialogue, and even though at the end you're not sure what the result will be in terms of changing laws, throughout the sandbox you still get an idea of how something works, and then you can then have food for thought for your own policy making activities. So I think that the sandbox is a good idea in any case to have it. As I said, it's not clear what the results will be at the end, but I think it's still a good thing because, yeah, you can still learn from each other, from the regulator and the business side. You can have a continuous dialogue. Room for improvement, as I said, it's not very inclusive. There's no funding, so not everyone can participate. The issue of transparency, making everything open for everyone so that everyone can learn from it. And then there are also unanswered questions, which I think are relevant here. And one of them is, do we need a European sandbox? Because in the financial services sector, which is where the sandbox process started out, let's say, they've already started talking about having multi-country sandboxes. And So I see the point of financial services because you don't need that much physical infrastructure like in energy. But what about energy? I think it would be tricky to have a multi-country sandbox because every country has their own way of regulating energy and the grid. However, something that is important to note is that a lot of these sandboxes do not allow you to derogate from European legislation. And European legislation is more and more including energy-related regulations. So if you cannot derogate from EU legislation, then your sandbox cannot really go very far. So I think that in that sense, having an EU sandbox could be good, because then you could maybe derogate from EU laws, which you cannot do right now. Then another question is the fact that, as I said, laws will always move behind technology. And with a sandbox, the final aim is to have new laws. But is that a sustainable means of moving forward? I think that it would be good to perhaps have a continuous sandbox. So have a sandbox the entire time so that as regulators, you can keep track of the technology, because that will move every day, that will change every day. So if you draft a law today, it will be old tomorrow. So I think that how to regulate will have to be rethought, let's say, whether you need laws or more loose standards or principles, I don't know. But in any case, I think that the sandbox is a very important element to keep in place and not just a temporary measure just to see how it goes. I think it should be a continuous process. So those are my points, and thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. If you have any other questions, you can email me if they haven't been answered now. I'm also on social media, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra. So let me